Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk Show with Waylon Lewis, coming to you live from Boulder, Colorado, or not live at all if you're watching this later on the YouTubes, the internets. Today I'm very excited because we're talking about something that I actually care about. Unlike usual, when I just listen to people blab and promote their bullshit, today we actually get to talk about something kind of seemingly esoteric but super important, which is basically that Buddhism is so hot right now, kids. Teenagers, get into it. It's the biggest thing. There's Instagram, there's Snapchat, then there's Buddhism. Buddhism is so hot right now. Everyone's into it, but they're kind of dumbing it down. They're taking away the Buddhism, taking out the yummy mindfulness, and then just going on with their douchebag jobs, destroying the whole world through capitalism, and getting rid of that weird Buddhist stuff where you want to be a benefit to other people. So I have two, it's sort of like hardball today. I have Jonathan on the one, and I'm wearing the bow tie of what's his name. So we have Jonathan McKeever, who I grew up with. He was my childhood idol, mostly because he was super tall, still is super tall. And he's coming to us from the Bay Area, and he's pro-capitalism. He doesn't really care about Buddhism. That's his stance. And then we have, I'm kidding, we'll get to the in-depth discussion. And then I have Feit, who's like your activist. Of course, he lives in Oakland. He teaches Buddhism, philosophy, and yoga, so I'm pretty intimidated to argue with him. But hopefully Jonathan and I can team up on him. That's sort of my plan, Jonathan. And we're going to begin this conversation with a little, actually I'll lay the ground a little bit more. So I've had Sakyong, Reggie Ray, Sharon Salzberg, all kinds of great Buddhist teachers on here recently, many of whom are involved in Wisdom 2.0, which is where the sort of tech scene gets together with folks who teach mindfulness. And I've been asking them, you know, mindfulness is super hot. Right now it's been on the cover of Time magazine saying the mindfulness revolution is here or whatever. Is this a good thing now that it's so accessible that, you know, Congressman Tim Ryan was just on the show, and he's helping mindfulness connect with soldiers with PTSD or with students, children who have all kinds of issues, bullying and insecurity and ADHD. Obviously, there's a lot of benefits to it, but then there's also concerns that it's basically being appropriated and we're leaving behind the mission. So that's sort of the ground for this conversation. I'm super excited to have Sean and Jonathan here so that hopefully we can have a meaningful discussion that will actually help in some way kind of turn the compost heap of this you know, very rich and kind of dangerous time for the evolution of Buddhism in the West and in the world generally. So I have now talked so much, I have bored myself. We will begin with a bow that Jonathan has agreed to lead, and then Sean will lead us in a minute of meditation, and then we'll jump in. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thanks for the introduction, Waylon.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just introduce the bow. The way we start is by just taking a simple seat, feeling our weight, our ass on the chair or the cushion, feeling the earthiness, the quality of solidity of our body, and then connecting with the vast feeling of space or sky around us. And there's a quality of heart, too, between the two, of the earth. And when you feel like you've touched in with that, just offer it away. Just complete. Give it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. So for a moment of meditation, I'll suggest that continuing from the grounded approach that Jonathan brought to the bow, that we could each just bring our full intimate presence into the sense of our bodies, however we are, sitting or standing, however we are, seeing or listening. And then allow that sense of immediate grounded presence to just blossom through the body as a kind of simple, awake availability, really, for the heart to move, for feeling, to mind to move in thought. And that as we listen to each other and speak and engage with ideas, that we stay grounded as much as we can in the body, and just to take a moment now to let that grounded, intimate presence fill us. There's the breath, there's gravity, there's each of us in our full humanity, just here. And I like this ethos that, again, Jonathan brought. Take that beautiful stance, and in a spirit of generosity and openness to the world, we let it go.
Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you, Jonathan. So this all rose out of, somewhat ironically, but also quite fittingly, a conversation on Facebook that you two were having a debate, but also you found a lot of room for common ground. So what's your basic view? Maybe we could begin, Sean. You mentioned that the Buddha's teachings are in some way radical. What do you mean by that?
This is one of the critiques that has arisen, I think, largely within a Buddhist practitioner community around the institutionalization or secularization of mindfulness. And there's a few different critiques that I hope we'll get to. This one points to what the original intent, and when I say the original, that's contentious. So I'll say that I'm referring to modern interpretations of mindfulness or sati, we'll get to the meaning of that word, as it appears in the Pali Canon, so the tradition of texts that are the earliest direct record we have of what the Buddha perhaps said. And that in that tradition, mindfulness is presented, first of all, as part of the whole Buddhist path, but also very specifically as a practice of inquiry, where as we become aware of our experience moment to moment, which is the basic mindfulness instruction, to know what's happening in the body and feelings in the mind, that what happens for us over time as that becomes a deep and well-practiced stream of unfolding is that we begin to see through all of the structures of habit and mind that constrict us, that cause us to suffer. And I call it radical, and many of my colleagues call it radical, because when this thing gets some momentum, we don't just see through like what's making us a little bit stressed out at work, but we might see through the very foundation of ego structure itself. We see that the patterns and habits and conditions that make up my personality are also unstable and based on circumstance. That means my whole sense of myself, who I am, what I am, actually can be thrown into very substantial question. And so I consider mindfulness to be the seed of a deep existential inquiry that has the potential to really undo my sense of stability in the world. For this reason, it's being accompanied on many intensive retreats right now by the presence of trauma therapists and psychologists. The tagline that I would give for this, in a way, is something like, mindfulness in the corporation, playing with fire. Do you know what you're doing? By bringing this kind of inquiry in.
So to go back to 2002, which is when Elephant started, and our slogan was the mindful life, and at the time no one was using the word mindful. And my point is not that we were like the hipsters around that word, but that it wasn't, mindfulness wasn't a part of our everyday culture, or that term wasn't. Now, John Kabat-Zinn has done a lot of work popularizing that term and also just kind of stripping away a lot of the Buddhist context that you just referred to. But Jonathan, you and I grew up in the tradition of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who also sort of did a similar thing. He took the Buddhist teachings, he put them in this kind of context of Shambhala training and took away kind of a lot of the Buddhist path, but still had view. View was very much a part of that. So how do you feel about this sort of, basically like taking mindfulness and using it the way it is being used now is just to, as Sean referred, just to sort of deal with stress, be better at, our job at Google, or be better at family person, just be better in life.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned Shambhala, because having grown up in that community, I do think there's a possibility that that I have a skewed understanding of what we're calling secular mindfulness. Insofar as with the Shambhala training path, there's a very careful presentation of the mindfulness path that includes essentially a view of what we're doing, what we would call view, practice, and action, which also incorporates this notion of Shila that Sean's asked for.
And what is that?
So Shila, yeah, thank you. Shila is, if you divide the Eightfold Path into 3 parts, Shila is this idea of morality. But morality in this particular case has to do, in my sort of limited understanding, with the notion that when you're engaging in a path of mindfulness, you're not just concentrating, you're not just becoming a better whatever, you're actually connected to other people around you. And you're connected to some extent, from an ethical perspective, to a kind of collective whole or a bigger picture. So whether you call that loving kindness, whether you call it metta practice, whether you call it, there's a sense that you're bound in, and so when you talk about right action, or when you use the word right, there's a sense of appropriateness, of skillfulness. So I just wanted to say that sort of growing up in the Shambhala community, there was this secular approach to mindfulness that was actually very rich and very full. It wasn't divorced from Buddhism. But I'd also say that further, having taken a look at some of the corporate programs being run, and I'll say corporate, but I actually would prefer to use the word organizational, because I don't distinguish between a mindfulness program being run at an NGO or nonprofit and one that's run instead at, say, a corporation like Google. And we can talk about that in a little while. But I see a lot of heart in that presentation of mindfulness. And that's where I would say that heart, the mindfulness isn't just concentration. Sharon Salzberg talks about mindfulness being a combination of concentration, awareness, and compassion. And that's what makes it different than just a concentration exercise. And when I picked up Meng's book, SIY, Search Inside Yourself Leadership, I noticed that there was a lot of heart. Mindfulness isn't being presented in an environment or a context devoid of heart. It's actually very centrally linked into it. So Meng's view, or Meng's goal, is actually nothing short of world peace. And so the presentation of mindfulness through this has a very sort of structured approach to unfolding that includes that perspective around the simple act of sitting still.
So the key point seems to be that if mindfulness is still joined with the sort of Mahayana or heart or compassion or being of service in the world kind of context, then we're okay. If it's just mindfulness for stress or mindfulness for life, obviously it's not harmful in any way, but you're kind of missing out on all the good stuff. Would you agree with that, or either of you?
Well, I just wanted to say, and Sean, I'm really curious about your answer to that. I'm not saying that it's therefore okay, and I'm certainly not poo-pooing the discussion. I think this is a really important discussion to have. There are a lot of questions that come up around this topic, and I'm hoping we can explore some of that today. Yeah. But what I'm saying is, do we really have the choice? And my whole view is that we don't really have the choice here. Chogyam Trungpa talked about business being the Tantra of America. And what he meant by that is Tantra can be loosely translated as continuity. that what he meant by that was it's not necessarily just an overlay of this foreign system on humanity. It's actually an expression of the way humanity's working together. So do we as Buddhists stay on the sidelines and wait for the right type of situation, or do we leap in and engage with what is? And in this particular case, Buddhists and commerce. So I'd say it's not so much that it's an ideal situation, but it is the situation that we have. And so that's pretty much my inspiration.
I love that.
I
mean, what just to jump in quickly, what I would also add to that meaning of Tantra beyond thread, or being an organic expression of humanity, our Buddha nature, instead of just this sort of enemy. I regard capitalism as an enemy half the time, I have to admit. Only half the time, but about half the time. I've seen it kind of infect and dilute and twist a lot of great causes here in Boulder, Colorado. One example would be the natural products community, which was kind of inspired by environmentalism and is now all about creating a product in plastic, selling out to investors, and then going and buying your second home in some formerly pristine country. But Sean, you want to jump in?
Yeah. So a couple of things about ethics. In a way, like Jonathan said, it's he and both of you are coming from a very Buddhist framework in terms of upbringing, like around Shambhala, that was presented technically as secular, but actually was fairly overtly Buddhist. And it's interesting, when Jabun Kabat-Zinn started the mindfulness-based stress reduction program at the UMass Medical Center, which is one of the sort of seeds of secular mindfulness now. His training was in the Theravadan Buddhist system in Vipassana, with Western and Asian teachers, so in the Pali Canon tradition. He very literally and overtly said that they were going to try to teach exactly Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, without using any Dharma words, but that the goal was to have everything in it that was in the Dharma. So a relation to suffering and its release, an ethical foundation, a foundation of non-dual view, in a sense, coming not so much from the Vipassana tradition, but more from Zen. Kabat-Zinn was a student of a Korean Zen teacher as well. And that all of this would be, in a sense, kind of under the radar. But he said literally, and he repeated this in a recent paper, that he thinks that substantial training in Buddhism, and specifically Buddhist meditation, is imperative for MBSR teachers, for mindfulness-based stress reduction teachers. So he really understands MBSR as kind of stealth Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And so some of the critiques that have come up around particularly the ethical piece in institutional mindfulness is, one is that when a practice of attentional focus, even in a context of heart and interconnectedness, which is part of what I feel Jonathan referring to, and I agree actually that programs like Search Inside Yourself, from what I understand about them, they seem lovely. So first of all, I'm not against them, and I'm really happy that there's a strong element of heart there. One critique has arisen in the Buddhist world that without a very specific and literal teaching of ethics to go along with those practices, that the practices of attentional focus in and of themselves are basically ethically neutral. Like, they won't teach you to be a better person. They'll teach you to just focus, in a sense, on what's happening right now. And some of that was really the motor behind the protest at Wisdom 2.0. And I'll just tell, since we haven't yet, I'll just tell very briefly the story of that. A representative of Google got up on stage to talk about mindfulness the Google way, and they were to tell about the Search Inside Yourself program. They were interrupted by anti-gentrification protesters talking about rising rents and inequality in San Francisco, and focusing on Google because the Google bus program had become a flashpoint for that particular protest. Anti-gentrification and inequality is a huge topic in SF, and it's way bigger than mindfulness or Buddhism. But Google stumbled into it, or some people would put that more harshly than I would. And the protest against them, my sense of it was protesters essentially saying, for Google to get up and trumpet its beautiful ethical mindfulness program while refusing to talk about their actions in the gentrification issue was essentially cognitive dissonance. And I used the stronger term saffron washing. Right. So using the Buddhist overlay or the Dharma or like look how good we are overlay to elide actually important issues. And then the representative of Google that was there actually got a lot of flack from the Buddhist community and the activist community, actually more than even the Buddhist community, for his response, which seemed to kind of want to shut down the conversation rather than continue it. And I hear that he's actually a wonderful guy and practitioner, but that was some of the activist response, particularly around the exclusion of a very active ethical stance in the mindfulness regime as it was being presented. So that's one foundation of that.
I would love to rejoin on that, Waylon, if I may.
Please.
So I think that that particular action that Sean mentioned, Amanda Ream and a group of activists jumped in on Wisdom 2.0 and called attention to Google's participation in gentrification, as Sean mentioned. So I respect Amanda's involvement in that, and I think people on stage actually did too. Bill Duane, who led a small meditation after the action, mentioned as such as well, respecting their views. Now, I would agree with Sean that the views weren't engaged with, but I will say this. I think that what we saw on stage at that particular event was part and parcel of the secular mindfulness movement. So I think it's a good thing to talk about because we have different views of it. One of the things I will say is that communication and mindful communication comes up hugely in a bunch of different corporate mindfulness approaches. So empathic listening, deep listening, it's also referred to. So I feel like I just wanted to call attention to that form of communication. I mean, you're really going up on stage, putting a banner in front of the people on stage, using a loudspeaker to shout at people in the audience about a subject that no one there was particularly prepared to talk about. So in that case, it's a departure from the orthodox. And I think a departure from the orthodox form of communication is skillful in some cases. And in this case, I would argue that maybe it was skillful because here we are having this conversation. But what I'd like to call attention to is, did Amanda and team consider the fact that if they want to let their opponent, Google and Bill Duane, respond in the best way possible, is the best way to come in, shout with a loudspeaker, and then basically sort of be unbudging? So what I would argue is that I would like an acknowledgement, or I'd like to consider the possibility that if you really do want an enlightened response, why not present it in a way that presents some space? I think what Bill Duane did afterwards, I thought it was the best thing possible until you, Sean, during one of our great discussions, explained to me what you thought could have gone better. What could have gone better, and I'm going to paraphrase you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is once the protesters were marshaled off stage, maybe Bill or other people on stage could have said, look, wow, this is a really important topic. It's a hot topic for us. And in the spirit of mindfulness, in the spirit of engaging that which is in front of our faces, let's have a conversation about this right now. Maybe what we thought was the point of this whole session isn't the point any longer. Let's bring them out and have a discussion. And I agree with you. That would have been an incredibly skillful thing, albeit much different. What I would have hoped, though, from an action perspective, though, is that the people doing the action would have let that happen more easily. It's very difficult to respond to a situation like that that's so sudden in a way that's accommodating. So I feel like Amanda did a good job at really challenging the leaders on stage to show what they had. So I just wanted to sort of present my thoughts on that particular thing. I thought Bill Dwayne, and for the audience, Bill Dwayne, what he did is basically said, now that that's over, let's just take a moment to feel our bodies, see how we feel about that. And I think that was referred to as spiritual bypass by some, and by others as a skillful way of non-ignoring. In fact, letting each person have their own viewpoint on what happened.
Yeah.
So because I think the Buddhist teachings are, if anything, they're not prescriptive on how you're supposed to walk away with experiences. And I think Bill Dwayne gave a really good, a good space for people to walk away from that with whatever experience they as individuals wanted to have.
Jonathan, let me jump in.
Sure.
I love this. This is super exciting. And I feel like we need 2 hours to get through this so that in a way that we can actually provide enough space to listen to one another, because I'm already having like 8 different things I want to say per minute. But I love the phrase saffron washing, and I also, growing up in the Shambhala tradition, which had a very healthy sense of humor and troublemaking. One of my favorite trucker hats actually says, you know, here comes trouble. And I feel like, you know, we come from a troublemaking tradition. I can imagine at the Shambhala Sun summer camps we went to as a kid, whenever anything challenging came up, we didn't just sit with it and feel our bodies, which I do think is important. I'm not denigrating that. But I think we would have jumped into it. I think Willie Ryken or whatever's would have said, let's talk about it. And on the other hand, I do believe that, you know, Trungpa Rinpoche really discouraged his students who were in the early days hippies and activists from being assholes, from being aggressive activists. He said, you know, deal with your own stuff first, then go be of service. If you're just going out, you know, that kind of aggressive but well-intentioned communication, and I can't speak to the people who did it because I wasn't there and I'm in Colorado, but, you know, you're creating an us-them kind of situation, which is kind of the basic play of ego, you know. So and it's ironic we're having this conversation within the context of Google+. This is a Google Hangout. So, you know, and I do think we can create a lot of like constructive trouble, hopefully, within this conversation. So, Sean, did you have anything?
Sure. I would love to, first of all, just, I would love to jump in favor of disruptive activism and just say there's totally a place for the megaphone, and especially when one feels like one is trying to be in a conversation with a force that holds unbalanced power. And so, you know, to quietly write to Google and say, excuse me, knock, knock, could we have an enlightened conversation about this massive social issue? There had been a lot of conversation happening, and I fully want to stand up in favor of, you know, loud disruptive action. And I was in favor of that action. And as Jonathan said, and basically I agree with everything you said about it, and with your telling of what I thought would have been a more skillful response, that in a sense, that protest was marvelously successful. Because of many things. The conversation has continued, it's been very rich, here we are, all good. So one thing that you just said, Waylon, kind of touched on one of the, I think, subtler and more kind of overtly leftist critiques that's been out there right now. The most vocal proponent of it is the scourge Slavoj Žižek, who seems to hate Western Buddhism and capitalism with equal fervor. And this is a critique that says that if the core stance or approach being taught in secular mindfulness is a kind of passive witnessing of one's experience, in other words, like the definitions of mindfulness given in some of these programs, that it's a present moment, aware, intimate, non-judgmental awareness that essentially teaches us to feel what's happening without immediately acting on it. And this is a good basic mindfulness instruction, right? I would give this as a good first instruction to meditators all the time. But if this is the basic stance being taught, the critique has come out, oh, what a useful kind of brainwashing to teach to oppressed workers, to say, oh yeah, here's the enlightened stance. Just notice what you're feeling and don't do anything about it.
Well, Sean, I mean, I would, as a meditation teacher of sorts myself, I would disagree with that interpretation. You know, I find that completely off base. Obviously, you're not judging your thoughts, good or bad, happy or sad.
Right.
As Trump Rinpoche says, it can be milk and cookies, or it can be murdering your mother. Doesn't really matter. But what's entirely active and not passive about it is the point is you're saying, this is all distraction. This is all the play of the ego. And I'm coming back to the present moment, dissolving my sense of self and being more awake and available and present. You're kind of, in a way, rejecting all of it in an equal way.
So I think that I agree with you, but I think that what you're describing depends on, and Jonathan used this word earlier, it depends on view. And so are we coming to our practice with a basic view of, for instance, dissolving the sense of self, with the intention toward the radical freedom that Buddha Dharma, that the Buddhist practice points toward? And for that, you know, I would have to go to the intentions really laid out by one of these programs and say, what are you actually trying to instill in people? Are you trying to make more productive, complacent workers?
Right.
And but I do think that this critique has some teeth, very much because even though, like, the three of us are all trained Buddhists in some way, right? And so I think we're assuming some things around what meditation practice entails.
Sure.
If I go to one of these programs and they say, hey, here's the way to be less stressed and happier, just notice what's happening without interfering, then
Sean,
as a critic, I can say, let's take that all the way. Notice, you know, notice workplace discrimination, and and it's like, oh, that's just your feelings. Just notice that, and feelings pass.
Right.
You know, are we instilling?
John, let me jump in for a second, just so we have time for dialogue. We're already only have 10 minutes left, but I'm completely in agreement with your follow-up, which is I can totally see this sort of passive meditation going over huge in the Wolf of Wall Street context, where you're like, you might have thoughts of going outside or having a life or a relationship or ethical questions about how you're ripping people off, but just come back to the present moment and then make money. You know, mindfulness is huge on Wall Street right now. So Jonathan, did you have anything to jump in with?
Yeah, I did, definitely. And I think this comes back to one of the key themes of our ongoing discussion, and I'm sure it will continue. First of all, Zizek's analysis of Western Buddhism, I think, is completely, it just demonstrates to me that he doesn't really understand Buddhism, and I think we've had this discussion. Nevertheless, I think his criticism is valid and important to look at. One of the things to keep in mind is in this debate, and one of the things that really got me involved and engaged in this whole discussion was this repeated claim that really what's going on with the mindfulness revolution is that people are being trained to be worker drones. And they're trained to have zero stress so that they can better accommodate the consumer capitalist machine. And that, in fact, like Zizek says, in fact, it's the best way possible for the system as such to continue its machinations forward, because you're using this tool to better acclimatize people to this terrible and tremendous suffering wrought by a political system. So I wanted to address that because I think that it's a really great discussion, but I also want to sort of make some clarifications here, which I think are just completely inaccurate. First one is, when looking at whether mindfulness is really used as a way to become more passive and a way to become more accepting of possibly conditions that aren't actually humanly acceptable, I started doing some investigation, and I looked at really from the perspective of various teachers who are teaching in the sort of free market landscape. What qualities are they seeking for? Because it's really important to look at what qualities are you seeking for. And some of the responses I got back were courage. Courage is huge. There's also compassion is a huge one. Courage is huge. I wanted to mention courage first just because it doesn't necessarily jibe with a shareholder statement. it's really encouraging people to sense what it is their own personal wisdom is telling them. In Meng's book, the Search Inside Yourself, about Search Inside Yourself, he mentions the case of several people who decided while and when engaging in mindfulness that their current position wasn't right. That dissatisfaction was actually allowed to blossom and bloom and then be trusted. That particular story involved that particular worker changing jobs or changing positions or whatever it might be. But the idea that, so I think when one begins to slow down and sensitize to the actual things going on, whether it's the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, and become more attuned, the first thing that happens is there's this moment where, I mean, that's really the birthplace of wisdom in some sense. So I think that sensitization is really what's encouraged. And then at least with SIY, it goes even further. It's basically saying that's the root of loving kindness. So that's empathy. So it starts with empathy, and then it moves out to how are you going to affect other people in the world. And that's really what leadership is referred to. So I haven't discovered any secular mindfulness programs which are sheerly about concentration and sheerly about accepting conditions. They're really about empowering the individual. And I know you'll respond to this, Sean, but in your comment about the sort of undercover Buddhism, there is a little bit of that. And Meng himself mentions in the SIY book that really the whole notion of improving efficiency, making better leaders, making more collaborative work environments is really the side goal. The real goal in his mind is for workers and people to be happy. And we can have a discussion about what happiness means, because I know there's some critique of the way different people mean it. But I wanted to clarify, I'm surprised that there haven't been more secular mindfulness folks piping in on these discussions, because I believe some of the assumptions that have been allowed to sort of go up and stay up are just simply not accurate. So.
I actually love that you told that story from Meng's book, and that he has that goal. In a way, what if that's really what's happening? He's teaching people to, let's just say, sense their current situation, feel for themselves, see what's right for them, develop discernment. What if that leads to more and more people becoming dissatisfied with their work environment? What if half of Google's staff was to take the program and quit? That at a certain point, the cultivation of all those good qualities that you described, and I would totally support them. At a certain point, the cultivation of here's a question: does the cultivation of individual well-being and courage, is it actually just in conflict with participating in a consumer society and in a consumer kind of oriented corporation? And a most basic example would be in the late 60s, as Thailand was starting to kind of try to ramp up and move toward being an industrial superpower, the Thai government formally asked the Thai Buddhist monks and nuns to stop teaching the Buddhist teaching of contentment, because they figured, rightly I think, that if people en masse continued to practice and value contentment, they would not become consumers. And I think that's true. And some of the monasticism, including a radical monk named Buddhadasa, who's just amazing, had to organize a protest against this request and push back strongly to say that removing contentment from the Buddhist teachings, kind of destroyed the foundation of the teachings. But if we teach people to be content with what they have and to feel themselves and to do what's healthy and good for them, what if I think that just undermines a consumer capitalist model at all, to start with. So basically, I love that Meng wants world peace and is teaching people to think for themselves in that way. And then it's like, okay, is his model at odds with Google's business model?
And I think right there you have the crux of our our discussion, and this is why it's so exciting, because I think we're getting to a point that's more gray. It's not so easy. I can't stand up here, certainly, nor could anyone probably, and say that by practicing the path of meditation, you will not indeed find yourself feeling that, what did you call it? Dissonance, cognitive dissonance with consumer capitalism. You may indeed find that. And but what I would do is take it one step further. You may indeed find that your cognitive dissonance isn't limited to the political or economic system. It's limited to the very way that we interact as humans. So I would take it bigger. I would say the cognitive dissonance is actually with what they call samsara, or the basic state of being or suffering. I would absolutely agree with that particular statement. And I'm curious to see, as I know you are as well, studies which show what happens to mindfulness practitioners who might have done it at Salesforce for an 8-week class. What happens to them ultimately? Do they end up quitting their jobs? Do they actually get promoted? Do they end up going crazy? Or do they end up just being sensitive human beings? Or more likely, does it just sort of meld into the fabric in a way that's less easy to measure? You know, I don't know. I want to know how this will turn out, but I think it's too early to say meditation as taught in the corporate landscape is wrong, which I feel is what I'm hearing, and that's one of my inspirations for joining this debate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to just, my reference point again is, and I acknowledge what Sean said. I love his point that I have a lot of assumptions about the kind of context of meditation and how it's taught in my experience, but that Trungpa Rinpoche really encouraged his students not to kind of go back to the land or reject society or reject capitalism even, but to kind of jump in with both feet with a sense of kind of delight and troublemaking and transform it on some level, whether or not that's just a fun philosophical kind of statement or if it's actually practical. I mean, I wrote a blog on Elephant that a couple years ago. I skipped meditation one morning. I meditate twice a day every day, and I skipped meditation in the morning, and I immediately got into like 5 kind of drama-full fights with colleagues and created all kinds of, you want to talk about like unnecessary suffering, samsara, like all kinds of self-righteous, me first, kind of the world is against me kind of stuff. And I'm throwing down my kind of aggression and kind of grouchy bear manifestation. And so I wrote this blog saying, when I don't meditate in the morning, I'm an asshole. The official title was something like, I'm not very good at my work. And it's interesting that when we do practice mindfulness meditation, and I'm still skeptical of, are we leaving behind the kind of ethical context to be of service? But when we practice coming back from our own self-obsession, we actually transform from the inside out our manifestation as husbands and wives and colleagues, and we create more peace. I asked this question of Jim Gimian, the publisher of Mindful and Shambhala Sun and all this, and he said very strongly, and I kind of disagree with him, I'm a little bit more on Sean's side, as it were, on this one, but he said very strongly that when you teach meditation to Marines, you're not just making them better killers, you're making them more relaxed and settled in themselves so they don't react so suddenly to, you know, say if they're operating a drone or they're patrolling the streets of Afghanistan, they don't shoot a kid who they think has a weapon. You know, they actually create peace within they connect more, they have more eye contact instead of more fear. Well,
I wonder, Waylon, if I could just jump in on that. I mean, I think there's a lot of mythologies that talk about Buddha going to the various mythological realms of existence to teach.
Right.
And I'm not trying to say we're Buddhas, but at the same time, our aspiration is such that, you know, if you go to the hell realm, you find beings in tremendous torment, preta, hungry ghosts, all these different, even up to the God realm. The point is that there's no discrimination that a trained soldier or a killer, a sniper, say, receiving meditation training.
By discrimination, you mean insight or wisdom?
Well, no, I think there's no discrimination, meaning I believe
Like
the
teach
call.
everyone.
Yeah, it's important to teach everyone the fundamental basics of mindfulness. I know this is a controversial topic, and that's what we're here to discuss. You encouraged us to say our piece. I feel that it's important to teach everyone. I can't make the claim that Jim Gimian made about how that soldier will then be improved, but I do believe that we have to trust the basic Buddha nature of the people we teach to some extent. And I don't mean trust that they'll do the right thing, because I don't know about that. In a lot of cases they won't. But you know what? If someone comes into a Buddhist program and does full and even becomes an ordained monk, I can't also trust necessarily that they're not going to become a murderer as well. I think there's a quality of trusting in the basic coincidence of that person coming into contact with Dharma,
Yeah.
and giving them the ability to sort of pull some of the clouds away from their perspective. Mm. Other than that, I can't, I don't think it's our job to marshal how people take and use Buddhism. Controversy.
No, basic agreement. And maybe I'll wrap it back to our very first point, and one that I think is important to bring in before we close, which is about view and the context of meditation teachings in a larger framework. So some mindfulness teachers I know, or some Buddhist teachers I know, are actually, in a sense, cutting loose the term mindfulness and saying, I no longer teach mindfulness. I can't go with that movement. I teach sati, or satipatthana, which are the Pali words meaning mindfulness or the foundation of mindfulness. And that's a way of saying, I refuse to go along with a story that says that this basic meditation technique by itself will give rise to all the necessary benefits. And I think that story starts to infect views that say, and I'll quote you just to be contentious, that we trust the basic Buddha nature of all people. I do basically trust that. If we want to use that term, the term itself is contentious. Basic goodness, very nice. I trust everybody's basic goodness. But I don't think that just learning meditation without a structure of view, and when I use view, I use it in a technical Buddhist way, meaning orientation towards suffering and its causes, orientation toward a path that proposes not just how to quiet the mind and be more intimate with oneself, but actually very clear guidelines for how to live in the world and how to act and how to understand what we're doing here. That when I take that underlying framework away, I really don't know what these techniques are actually encouraging people to do. So I would love to teach. I'm happy that, say, Marines are learning meditation, but I want to know what's the underlying framework that they're learning it within. And yeah. So, and so because I don't know, it probably makes better soldiers. Great. Have we just set aside the completely foundational teaching on not taking life in order to accomplish that very weird mashup?
Well, again, Jim's point was it might make them better peacekeepers instead of aggressive kind of, reactionary jerks. But we are well over time. Buddhists are very comfortable with open conversations and not solid answers. I really appreciate both of you coming forward. I'd frankly love to do it again. I mean, to me, this is not a philosophical debate. It's really about real people's lives and about the evolution or devolution of Dharma in the West, or as well as McMindfulness, as someone put it. And I love the term saffron washing. There's so much greenwashing and whitewashing in this world. There's so much douchery, to use one of my favorite words, in the world and in our personal lives. And I do see mindfulness as a good thing. I think it's very analogous to, in the yoga, the explosion of yoga studios, and Sean, you're a yoga teacher as well. There's a lot of sort of Mick yoga and people not really getting alignment or breath and just injuring themselves and not really connecting with the point of yoga or kind of true yoga as defined, again, by just very basic principles of like wanting to create peace or alignment or breath. Anyway, thank you so much, Sean Feit, Jonathan McKeever, two jolly good fellows. You can find all the conversations about McMindfulness and the mindfulness revolution that we've had on youtube.com/Waylon H. Lewis and SoundCloud. Thanks to our partners Google Plus for hosting this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And Sean and Jonathan, do you have any sort of final goodbye you'd like to offer?
Become mindful of ideology as it affects all of us. May we all awaken.
Thank you. And Jonathan?
I think that's the perfect summary of my feelings as well.
All right. Well, we agree on something. So thank you so much. We could end with a bow of mutual respect and a reminder of our mission to be of benefit and not just obsess about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.